isn't this just fantastic? Captain's Log, Subdates 21201.4. There have been very few instances within the ISO cubes where an inmate gets a round of applause for breaking such a major law. It's even more peculiar when the offender themselves is already a sex offender. Welcome everyone to the Halls of Injustice. Today we have inmate number 052, who is called Paul Fitzgerald. This is a rather interesting one because he committed the crime in prison. And it's also interesting because I think most of you are going to be okay with it. When I was doing research for this particular topic, I had a few issues because there are a number of articles, at least 12. Not a single one could give me a definitive answer on what the kitchen utensil Paul Fitzgerald used in the act that got him, well, banged up for a bit longer. So I took this to Twitter and asked for assistance. We'll get to it soon. I just thought I'd let you know if you saw that tweet. Here's the context. And your responses, by the way, are fantastic. So to give some backstory on Paul Fitzgerald, he has been, in his lifetime, convicted for a number of charges. For indecent assaults when he was aged 13 and 15, battery, criminal damage, actual bodily harm with intent to commit a sex offence, and possession of an offensive weapon, and false imprisonment. This man is a career criminal. There are some issues, mentally. They have been well documented, thankfully. And they certainly do arise when it comes to what he did that got him put back in prison even though he was already there, just ensuring he's going to be there for most, if not all, of his life. For the sake of the additional context, we now need to talk about another man called Richard William Huckle, who is the victim of Paul Fitzgerald's wrath. Richard Huckle was a regular worshipper at the Ashford Baptist Church. He was also a member of a church in London. This is important because Richard Huckle travelled to Malaysia on a number of occasions. He did a gap year in 2005 to 2006. He helped out at local churches, and he moved there permanently in 2010. But in 2014, he was arrested by officers from Britain's National Crime Agency. At the time, he was perceived as a good Samaritan, a go-getter, a helpful person who did a lot to help others who were less fortunate than himself. Richard Huckle is the UK's worst paedophile. That's what he's been dubbed by the news. I prefer most prolific sex offender against children. Richard Huckle kept a ledger that had 200 children that had been abused. The ledger was on a computer, but unfortunately, people weren't able to access certain encrypted sections of the hard drive to obtain a lot of the evidence. So most of his charges, when he was arrested in 2014, were kinda lost. Richard Huckle was found guilty of all the crimes he had committed against children, and he was sentenced after pleading guilty to 71 sexual offences, to life in prison with a minimum term of 25 years before being eligible for parole. My view, of course, is that's a whole life term in a very squalid situation where you'll never, ever actually leave the prison. I'm sure others have a far more severe sentence in mind for you, and it's with that in mind we go back to Paul Fitzgerald, because he knew who Richard Huckle was, because they were both in HMP Sutton, which is where those who are deemed high risk for a number of reasons are placed, whether it be because of their mental health, possible suicide, or because of the crimes they committed and what would happen if they were in a population that was a bit more general, open, and they spoke. On October 13th, 2019, Paul Fitzgerald went into Richard Huckle's cell, equipped with a few items. These items would include an electrical cord, a kitchen utensil, we'll get to that in a moment, and a bladed pen, which is where you take a pen and you put a razor blade at the end. Richard Huckle was then tied up and touched by Paul Fitzgerald, with the kitchen utensil being used to go in one end with the pen going up his nostril into his brain in the other. Two prison officers eventually managed to remove Paul Fitzgerald from Richard Huckle, but the damage was done at that point. Richard Huckle did in fact die. Paul Fitzgerald laughed, admitted to wanting to eat him, There was a fantasy involved here. This is pretty dark. Paul Fitzgerald did admit he had planned to take Richard Huckle out a week earlier, and that he had had intrusive thoughts about harming others for quite some time. But Huckle had to be the first because he wanted to know what it felt like. He also admitted he was having far too much fun when he was, taking out Richard Huckle. When this went to trial, psychiatrists evaluated Paul Fitzgerald, and they concluded he had lived with a conduct disorder from an early age, gender personality dysphoria, and a personality disorder. Jurors were informed Paul Fitzgerald was a risk to females and at risk of hostage-taking, and that he had been prescribed medication in the past, but he was not prescribed any at the time of Richard Huckle's passing. Before we continue, I just want to add, I am somewhat impressed that all those who are prosecuting Paul Fitzgerald for what he did managed to take this as seriously as they did when the majority of society holds such a low view of Richard Huckle and of Paul Fitzgerald, to be fair, which is why they're at odds. Oh, and I didn't quickly address the kitchen utensil, did I? Well, some of you suggested cattle prods, scoops, whisks, those lentil things, yep, potato peelers, a salt and pepper shaker, this butt plug, an immersion blender, which would serve two purposes because it would have the electrical cord as well. Somebody inserted garlic, a rolling pin, cheese grater, a rusty butter knife. The list really does continue. I am impressed. Thank you for your contributions. Understandably, because Paul Fitzgerald pled guilty to all of this, he was found guilty, and he was handed a sentence only fitting of a man who committed the crime he committed, which part of me finds really funny, but at the same time, you still killed a man. That's a crime. Don't worry. Even with such a heavy sentence, you'll get sent some cake from somebody, I'm sure. Paul Fitzgerald was sentenced to life in prison and will have to serve a minimum of 34 years before being eligible for parole. When he was sentenced, he started laughing, which led to Mr. Justice Lavender, a judge we have covered before on this channel, to call him a psychopath that derived pleasure from imagining torturing, raping, killing, and even eating others. You went into his cell equipped and intended to rape and kill Mr. Huckle, and, if possible, cook and eat parts of him. You did this for your own pleasure and to carry out justice. You also did this for help and to be referred to a high-security unit. This case involves sadistic conduct. You have convictions for indecent assaults from when you were 13 and 15, battery, criminal damage, assault occasioning actual bodily harm with intent to commit a sexual offence, and while in possession of an offensive weapon and false imprisonment. I am sure you made a conscious decision to kill him, as you said yourself. You committed murder in cold blood. Well then, goodbye, Mr. Fitzgerald. Enjoy the next at least 34 years. And we'll put Huckle's bones in the walls. We can't allow him to rest in peace. So we're going to make it quite uncomfortable for him. With what we've discussed today, I'd love to know what you think. So please do let me know in the comments down below. Hope you all have a fantastic day. Thank you all for listening. Yeah, we're not done yet. Turns out, after much searching and even more articles, I finally found what it was Paul Fitzgerald inserted up Richard Huckle's bottom. It was a spoon. I shouldn't laugh, but it took so long to find it.